Detroit, Michigan. If you lived on the East Side during the middle of the 20th century, you didn't need a calendar to know it was a brewing day. You simply stepped outside and inhaled. The air didn't just carry the scent of the city's exhaust. It was heavy with the rich, sweet aroma of roasting malt and the sharp green bite of hops drifting for 5 miles in every direction. At the corner of Gratiot Avenue and the I-75 freeway, the industrial cathedral of the Stroh Brewery loomed over the neighborhood, its iconic red neon sign a glowing promise that Detroit was a place that made things, and made them with more pride than anywhere else on earth. Inside those massive brick walls, the scene was one of industrial poetry. While every other major brewer in America had long since switched to the cold, sterile efficiency of steam-heated tanks, Stroh's stubbornly clung to a tradition brought from the Rhineland in 1850. They called it fire brewing. Workers and tour groups would stand behind thick glass observation windows, their faces reflecting a dangerous, flickering orange light as 10 to 15-foot flames roared directly beneath massive copper kettles holding thousands of gallons. You could feel the heat radiating through the floorboards and hear a roar that could be detected 5 miles away, a physical manifestation of a company's grit and obsession with a process that caramelized the sugars and gave the beer a depth that merciless arithmetic could never replicate. But on February 8th, 1985, that glow began to fade into an unmistakable reality of silence. Inside a wood-paneled press room at River Place, the atmosphere was cold and clinical. Peter Stroh, the fourth-generation leader of an American dynasty, stepped toward a cluster of microphones. He wasn't there to announce a new blue ribbon or a record-breaking expansion. He was there to oversee the terminal conclusion of a 135-year-old legacy. With a few short, rehearsed sentences, he announced that the brewery on Gratiot Avenue would close its doors forever, casting 1,000 workers into an uncertain future, just as the city's industrial floor was beginning to drop out. The shock rippled through the neighborhood. This was a company that had survived the Civil War, outsmarted the technology trap of Prohibition by pivoting to ice cream, and remained a profitable anchor through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. To the men and women on the line, many of them second- or third-generation employees, Stroh's was Detroit. If Stroh's could die, nothing was sacred. How does a family empire that did everything right for 5 generations, a company that was, at that very moment, the 3rd largest brewer in the United States, suddenly vanish? How does a minnow swallow a whale only to choke on the bones? The fall of Stroh's is the ultimate lesson in the industrial aftermath, a warning that excellence and tradition are no shield against the unforgiving mathematics of a $500 million debt. Trap, did your father or grandfather carry a Stroh's badge? Do you still remember the sight of those 15-foot flames dancing in the heart of the city? Share your family's story in the comments below. We are keeping these memories alive. I'm your host, and this is Industrial Aftermath. Now, let's begin. To understand the unmistakable reality of silence that eventually settled over the ruins of Detroit's industrial corridor in 1985, we must first travel back to a world of fire, iron, and a different kind of grit and obsession. The Stroh story does not begin in a corporate boardroom or a modern glass and steel office park, but in the smoke of a continent tearing itself apart. In 1849, Germany was burning. The revolutions had failed, monarchies were crushing uprisings with clinical violence, and thousands of skilled craftsmen were fleeing for the promise of the New World. Among them was Bernhard Stroh, a 27-year-old brewer's son from the small town of Kern in the Rhineland-Palatinate. He carried with him everything he had earned working at his family's inn, exactly $150, and a singular handwritten family recipe for a light, Bohemian-style lager. This recipe was a masterpiece of unforgiving mathematics. At a time when most American beer was heavy, lukewarm ale, the Stroh family recipe required the patient art of cold fermentation, a technique that demanded stable, cool temperatures and weeks of waiting. When Bernhard stepped off the boat in Detroit in 1850, he found a modest river town of only 21,000 people. Most were fellow German immigrants who had fled the same chaos he had, and they arrived with a deep cultural thirst for the taste of the old world. They didn't want the thick, filling drinks of the English tradition. They wanted the crisp, refreshing Pilsner that Bernhard carried in his head. But there was no industrial cathedral waiting for him on the banks of the Detroit River. To build an empire, Bernhard had to embrace the merciless arithmetic of the immigrant struggle. He started his operation in a dirt-floor basement on the city's east side with nothing but a single copper kettle and a wooden wheelbarrow. This was an era of organized chaos, where he would labor over the mash tun during the day, the basement filling with the sweet, heavy scent of roasting malt and hops. Once the barrels were loaded onto his wheelbarrow, he sold his beer door to door through the tight-knit German neighborhoods, building his reputation one glass at a time. He was governed by the blacksmith's oath of industrial integrity. A name meant nothing if the work fell apart. The quality of his Bohemian lager was so unmistakable that within a decade, the rhythm of hammers returned to his life in the form of expansion. Demand had completely outpaced the capacity of a single basement, and Bernhard realized that to survive the coming industrial age, he needed a monument to industrial ambition. In 1865, as the Civil War reached its bloody conclusion and American industry began an unprecedented boom, Stroh purchased land on Gratiot Avenue and built a proper, large-scale brewery. He named it the Lion's Head Brewery, adopting the heraldic lion from Kierberg Castle back in his homeland as the family crest. That lion would remain stamped on every bottle for the next 150 years, a symbol of a sacred industrial compact between the family and the city of Detroit. By the 1870s, the rhythm of the plant was the heartbeat of the East Side. Stroh was no longer just a man with a wheelbarrow. He was an industrialist shipping beer across Michigan via the rapidly expanding railroads. When Bernhard Stroh died in 1882 at the age of 59, his son, Bernhard Jr., took the helm with no hesitation. The business had been his training ground since childhood, and he understood a truth his father hadn't needed to face. Scale mattered. He began investing in the latest technology traps, refrigerated rail cars and pasteurization innovations that destroyed the protection of geography and allowed him to dominate the home market completely. By 1900, the Stroh Brewery was producing 300,000 barrels annually, standing as the largest brewer in Detroit. They had moved from a basement and a wheelbarrow to an industrial cathedral of brick and steam. The family had built exactly what they set out to create, a reputation for quality that sold itself. But even as they celebrated their blue ribbon at the World's Fair in 1893, the merciless arithmetic of history was preparing a new challenge, a threat that would test their stubborn refusal to quit in ways a simple wheelbarrow never could. On January 16, 1920, the unmistakable reality of the Volstead Act settled over America like a cold, gray shroud. For the city of Detroit, which had built its identity on the rhythm of hammers and the roar of the forge, the news arrived with the force of an industrial collapse. Overnight, the third largest industry in the nation was rendered a criminal enterprise by the stroke of a pen. Inside the industrial cathedrals along Gratiot Avenue, the fires were ordered extinguished and the copper kettles drained. In Detroit alone, a dozen breweries closed their doors permanently within the very first year, their workers fired and their equipment sold for scrap. For most, it was the end. For the Stroh family, it was a call to embrace a level of grit and obsession that the rest of the industry considered pure delusion. While their competitors were surrendering to the merciless arithmetic of a dry nation, the Stroh family made a decision that seemed, to outside observers, to be an act of madness. They refused to shut down the plant. They refused to fire their workforce, and they refused to let their massive, state-of-the-art equipment go cold. They understood the American Industrial Compact, the sacred unspoken promise that if a worker gives their life to the company must fight to protect that worker's future. To honor this compact, They changed their name to the Stroh Products Company, scrubbing the word brewery from their letterhead, and began a 13-year masterclass in industrial survival. The pivot was a masterpiece of organized chaos. The same 6 million square foot complex that had breathed malt and hops now began to exhale the sweet scent of sugar and cream. In a stroke of engineering genius, the family realized that their massive refrigeration systems and cooling vats, the very technology trap that should have bankrupted them, could be repurposed to freeze and store ice cream. They launched the Alaska brand ice cream, using their existing bottling lines and delivery trucks to saturate the neighborhood grocery stores. They produced birch beer, ginger ale, club soda, and even malt syrup, which was marketed for baking, though the unmistakable reality was that every household in Detroit was using it for illegal home brewing. However, the true cornerstone of their Prohibition masterclass was the Stroh near beer strategy. During those 13 long, dry years, most competitors who attempted to stay in the market produced a near beer that tasted like watered-down failure because it was chemically stripped and poorly engineered. Stroh did it differently. They continued to brew full-strength, high-quality beer using the same fire brewing process they had perfected since 1914. Only after the beer was fully aged did they add a final, careful step to remove the alcohol. This was a gamble of unforgiving mathematics. It cost more to make beer this way, but it ensured the flavor remained unmistakably Stroh's. The genius of this strategy wasn't just in the taste, but in the instant restart it provided. On December 5, 1933, when Prohibition was finally repealed, the world shifted again in an instant. While competitors like Goebel, Pfeiffer, and Schmidt scrambled in a panic to fire up rusted boilers, rehire scattered workers, and rebuild collapsed distribution networks, Stroh was already standing at the finish line. The very next day, Stroh was selling full-strength, legal beer to the thirsty masses of Detroit. They didn't need to rebuild. They simply stopped the de-alcoholizing step. The beer that had been flowing through their system for 13 years under the guise of near beer was suddenly the liquid gold of a new era. The equipment that never went cold fired up immediately, and the workers who had stayed through the darkest years were rewarded with a security that would last for decades. It was more than a business victory. It was industrial poetry in action, a stubborn refusal to quit that cemented Stroh's as the undisputed heartbeat of the city. They had survived the silence, unaware that the next century would bring a different kind of poison pill that no amount of ice cream could ever fix. By 1945, as the guns of World War II fell silent and the soldiers returned to the American heartland, the city of Detroit didn't just return to its previous rhythm. It exploded into an era of unprecedented industrial ambition. The arsenal of democracy was retooling from tanks to cars, and the population was surging toward nearly 2 million people. In this world of sweat, steel, and assembly lines, there was a specific reward waiting at the end of every grueling shift: an ice-cold bottle of Stroh's. The auto workers of the Big Three didn't want a generic product shipped in from Milwaukee or St. Louis. They demanded a Detroit beer, brewed by people who shared their grit and obsession. At the center of this fierce loyalty was a process that Stroh had adopted in 1914, a unique European technique known as fire brewing. While the rest of the American brewing industry had retreated into the sterile, calculated efficiency of steam-heated kettles to save on maintenance and energy, the Stroh family stubbornly clung to the use of direct flame. This wasn't merely a point of pride, it was a matter of industrial poetry. Inside the brew house, the scene was one of overwhelming spectacle, as 10 to 15-foot flames roared directly beneath massive copper kettles that held thousands of gallons of beer. To stand behind the thick glass observation windows of the plant was to feel the radiating heat, hear the thunder of the burners, and inhale the heavy, sweet scent of roasting malt. The direct flame did what steam could never replicate. It caramelized the malt sugars in a specific way, creating a flavor profile that was deeper, richer, and unmistakably distinct from its national rivals. For the workers, Tending these massive fires was more than a job. It was a sacred industrial compact, with a process that refused to be rushed or simplified. By 1956, the Stroh Brewery reached its absolute high water mark, pumping out a staggering 2.7 million barrels of beer in a single year. That translates to more than 83 million gallons of liquid Detroit pride moving through the city's veins. The factory complex on Gratiot Avenue had grown into a true monument to industrial ambition, spanning over 1 million square feet. It was a labyrinth of cream-colored brick and iron where buildings dating back to the 1860s stood shoulder to shoulder with modern expansions from the 20th century. For anyone entering the city on the I-75 freeway, the Cathedral of Gratiot was an unmistakable landmark, anchored by a tower that featured the words Stroh's Beer in brilliant red neon. This plant was the undisputed heartbeat of the East Side, providing more than just beverages. It provided a level of middle-class security that felt as permanent as the river itself. The brewery workers were part of a blue-collar aristocracy, earning union wages that were, in some cases, triple the federal minimum wage. A job at Stroh's meant a home, a car, and the ability to send your children to college, often the first in the family to go. It was a world of generational pride, an unmistakable reality where sons followed their fathers into the same foundry, and the company's identity was woven into the fabric of the city through sponsorships of the Detroit Tigers, the Red Wings, and the Grand Prix. But standing at this peak in 1956, with the parking lots full and the furnaces at their brightest, nobody could hear the unforgiving mathematics of the future. The very spectacle of fire brewing the thing that gave the beer its soul was also a technology trap. It required more labor, more energy, and more maintenance than the modern, automated systems being built by the national giants in the Midwest. The concrete palace on Gratiot Avenue was thriving, unaware that the very traditions that made it legendary were quietly setting the stage for a debt trap that would one day turn the roar of the furnaces into the unmistakable reality of silence. By 1958, the industrial cathedral on Gratiot Avenue was no longer just a site of production. It was a target. The world of the American industrial compact was suddenly interrupted by a violent fracture in the rhythm of the city. The Detroit beer strikes, which shut down 5 major breweries simultaneously. For weeks, the furnaces at Stroh, Goebel, and Pfeiffer went cold as workers walked the picket lines demanding higher wages and better conditions. But as the rhythm of hammers ceased, a new and terrifying, unmistakable reality emerged from the silence. National giants like Anheuser-Busch, Miller, and Pabst companies with deeper pockets and massive national advertising budgets saw the paralysis in Detroit as a strategic invitation. They flooded the city's grocery stores and corner taverns with Budweiser and Miller High Life, claiming the shelf space that had once been the exclusive territory of the local heroes. When the strike finally ended, the damage was already done. Consumers who had been forced to try something else discovered they didn't mind the taste of the national brands, and the door to Detroit was left permanently cracked open. Inside the boardroom, the shift was even more profound, as a new generation began to look at the ledgers through the lens of merciless arithmetic. Peter Stroh, a Princeton graduate who joined the company in 1951, saw things differently than the family members who had built the empire on tradition alone. He recognized that the very thing that made Stroh's a legend, the signature fire brewing process, was becoming a technology trap. While the national giants were building automated, hyper-efficient plants using steam-heated systems, Stroh stubbornly clung to a technique involving 10 to 15-foot flames roaring beneath massive copper kettles. It was a spectacle of industrial poetry, but it required significantly more labor, more energy, and more maintenance than the modern systems favored by the Motor City's new competitors. The Gratiot Avenue facility, a sprawling 1 million square foot monument to industrial ambition, was now facing the unmistakable reality of its own geography. It was landlocked, surrounded on all sides by the dense urban grid of Detroit, with absolutely no room for the modern expansion required to compete on a global scale. Maintenance costs for the aging infrastructure, which included buildings dating back to the 1860s, began to spiral as efficiency declined. The elaborate Puabic tile work and hand-polished copper kettles were stunning to look at, but they were becoming an anchor dragging down the company's margins. Peter Stroh saw the trap closing. The middle ground of the profitable regional brewer was disappearing. In the new world of television and interstate highways, a company either grew into a national titan or faced the industrial aftermath of obsolescence. The math was as brutal as the heat of the furnace. National brewers could advertise on every screen in America, achieve massive economies of scale, and undercut regional prices while still spending less per barrel than Stroh spent per case. To combat this, Peter broke with a century of family tradition and began recruiting professional managers from outside the dynasty experts, from Procter & Gamble and PepsiCo, who understood marketing, distribution, and the sheer power of volume. The goal was articulated with a desperate clarity that shocked longtime employees: go national or die. By 1971, Stroh ended its 40-year relationship with its local Detroit advertising agency, hiring a national firm to project the brand into the living rooms of every American home. On paper, the expansion looked like a triumph of grit and obsession, as the company climbed into the top 10 and reached a capacity of 7 million barrels annually. But Peter Stroh saw that the Detroit plant was already running at its absolute limit, trapped within its own brick walls. He realized that to survive the coming beer wars, the company would have to do the unthinkable and buy its way to the top. They were preparing to take a gamble so large it would either cement their legacy or act as a poison pill that would silence the fire-brewing furnaces forever. They were the pride of Michigan, but the unforgiving mathematics of the future was already preparing a debt trap that would turn their industrial cathedral into the dust of a terminal implosion. By 1980, the industrial cathedral on Gratiot Avenue was facing a reality that no amount of fire-brewing tradition could mask. The Stroh Brewery was 8th in the nation, profitable and stable, but in the eyes of the market, they were utterly doomed if they remained stagnant. The merciless arithmetic of the era had dictated a new binary rule for the American beer industry. You were either growing into a national titan or you were waiting to be erased. Peter Stroh looked at the landscape and realized the company couldn't build its way to scale that would take decades and billions they didn't have. To survive, they would have to buy their way to the top, hunting for struggling breweries to absorb their capacity. The first move in this high-stakes game of industrial ambition came in 1981, when Stroh purchased the F&M Schaefer Brewing Company. Schaefer had once been a powerhouse in the Northeast, but it had been hollowed out by the low-calorie beer wars of the 70s. While the Schaefer brand itself was becoming toxic, it possessed the one thing Stroh desperately needed to escape the landlocked walls of Detroit: a modern, hyper-efficient brewery in Allentown, Pennsylvania. This facility was a masterpiece of industrial poetry, a gleaming world of automated conveyor belts and stainless steel with the capacity to churn out over 1 million gallons. On paper, it was the perfect pivot, but the acquisition cost the family more than just money. It drained their focus and management attention just as the battlefield was getting hotter. Then, in early 1982, the ultimate gamble appeared on the horizon. The Schlitz Motor Company, the legendary beer that made Milwaukee famous, was dying. A decade of catastrophic management decisions, including formula changes that had made the beer virtually undrinkable, had sent the brand into a terminal tailspin. Between 1976 and 1981, Schlitz sales had collapsed from 24 million barrels to just over 14 million. It was for sale, and a fierce bidding war erupted between Pabst, Heilemann, and Stroh. Despite being smaller and having less capital than their rivals, Stroh bit hard. In April 1982, they raised their bid and purchased the entire Schlitz empire for $500 million. Industry analysts, watching from the glass towers of Wall Street, were stunned by the audacity of the move, famously describing it as the minnow swallowing the whale. Overnight, The blacksmith's descendants from Detroit had vaulted into the position of the third largest brewer in America. They now owned 7 brewing plants stretching from Texas to California, with a market value estimated by Forbes at $700 million. On the surface, it looked like a monument to success, but inside the ledgers, a debt trap was snapping shut. The merciless arithmetic of the deal was staggering. Stroh was now obligated to pay more in interest on the $500 million in loans than the company's total annual profit. This wasn't just a financial burden, it was a poison pill that crippled their ability to innovate. Every cent of profit that should have gone toward national advertising to fight Budweiser and Miller was instead sucked away by the unforgiving mathematics of debt service. The Stroh family had bet everything on the assumption that the beer market would keep growing forever. But the unmistakable reality was that the market was flattening as health consciousness rose and consumers drifted toward wine and spirits. They now owned a massive 31 million barrel capacity in a world that only wanted to buy 24 million of their barrels. The industrial aftermath was no longer a distant threat. It was written in the interest rates of their own expansion. They had achieved the scale of a titan, only to realize they had traded their soul for a blueprint for disaster. The rhythm of hammers in the Detroit plant was about to be met by the cold, secondary logic of consolidation, proving that sometimes, in the race to go national, the prize you win is the very thing that destroys you. On February 8, 1985, the cold gray air of Detroit was punctuated by a silence that felt heavier than any winter storm. Inside the wood-paneled press room of River Place, the renovated former headquarters on the riverfront, Peter Stroh stepped toward the microphones. He was the fourth-generation steward of an industrial cathedral that had stood as a landmark for 135 years, but the words he was about to speak would dismantle that legacy in a single afternoon. With a clinical, rehearsed precision, he announced that the Stroh Brewery on Gratiot Avenue would close its doors forever. The room, packed with reporters and state officials, went instantly still, a localized pocket of the unmistakable reality that was about to ripple through the entire city. This was not just another factory closure in a city that was already bleeding. This was the hollowing out of a dynasty. The merciless arithmetic of the decision was staggering. 1,000 jobs were being erased, and a $40 million annual payroll was vanishing from a local economy that was already in the grip of a terminal decline. For the families of the East Side, the announcement arrived like a physical blow. These were not temporary laborers. They were second- and third-generation employees. These were men and women whose grandfathers had survived Prohibition by making ice cream, and whose fathers had kept the fire-brewing furnaces roaring through the Great Depression. They had grown up watching the flickering orange glow of the 10 to 15-foot flames through the observation windows, believing that as long as the beer flowed, their future was secure. The emotional weight of the closure was tied to the fact that Stroh's was Detroit. While the auto plants were shedding jobs and the city's population was collapsing from its 1950 peak of 1,800,000 toward 1 million, the brewery had remained an anchor, a concrete palace of stability. To close the Gratiot facility was to admit that hometown loyalty was dead, sacrificed on the altar of a $500 million debt trap created by the acquisition of Schlitz. The workers learned the news not from their supervisors, but from the evening broadcasts, clutching their pink slips while the iconic red neon sign of the brewery tower continued to pulse overhead, a glowing reminder of a promise that had just been broken. The brewery limped through the remainder of 1985, a ghost of its former self where workers showed up for final shifts knowing each day was a countdown to the end. Some took photographs of the massive copper kettles, while others collected small mementos, like the light bulbs from the tower sign, trying to hold onto fragments of a century of history. Then came April 1986. The industrial aftermath reached its violent climax as demolition crews placed explosive charges throughout the 1 million square foot complex. In a matter of minutes, the buildings that had stood since the 1860s, structures that had witnessed the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution, were reduced to a mountain of dust and twisted rebar. A second implosion followed in July, erasing the last remnants of the foundry and the fire-brewing halls. The roar of the furnaces, which had been the heartbeat of the neighborhood for generations, was replaced by the dull thud of falling brick and the long, hollow silence of an empty lot. Today, the land is known as Brewery Park, a generic corporate office space so thoroughly scrubbed of its past that no plaque or monument remains to tell the story of the 5 generations who built an empire there. The industrial poetry of the copper kettles and the pubic tiles has been traded for a landscape of asphalt and indifference. As we look at the empty space where the cathedral of Gratiot once stood, we see the final, brutal lesson of the Stroh legacy, that in the race for national scale, a company can grow so large that it loses its soul, and when that soul is gone, the buildings are never far behind. The lights went out, the dust settled, and a city was left to reckon with the unmistakable reality that even the strongest legends can be erased by a spreadsheet. By the mid-1980s, the industrial cathedral on Gratiot Avenue had been reduced to a memory of dust and rubble, but the ghost of its $500 million debt continued to haunt every ledger in the company's new headquarters at River Place. The Stroh Brewery was now trapped in a merciless arithmetic, where every dollar of profit was immediately devoured by interest payments, leaving nothing for the national advertising wars required to fight giants like Anheuser-Busch and Miller. In a desperate bid to outrun this unforgiving mathematics, management began to pivot away from the very thing that had defined them for 5 generations. In 1985, they launched White Mountain Cooler, a 5% alcohol malt beverage flavored with citrus and berry. It was a reach for the exploding popularity of wine coolers, an attempt to find a new monument to industrial ambition in the sugar-sweetened margins of the alternative beverage market. While it sold decently at first, it was a strategic mirage that could not offset the catastrophic collapse of their core beer brands. The company's identity began to fracture as they diversified into real estate development, turning their former pharmaceutical headquarters into a mixed-use complex on the Detroit riverfront. This move signaled an unmistakable reality. The family no longer believed that beer alone could save the empire. In 1995, the dynasty suffered its most profound psychological blow when Peter Stroh stepped down after 27 years of leadership, handing the reins to William Henry, the first non-family member to run the company in 145 years. Under this new clinical management, the company doubled down on a strategy of acquisition that would become their technology trap. In 1996, in a final, frantic attempt to gain scale, Stroh purchased the G. Heilemann Brewing Company. On paper, it was a massive expansion. In reality, it was a museum of American brewing's corpses. They had inherited a graveyard of weak, dying regional labels: Rainier, Olympia, Lone Star, and Old Style. The organized chaos of managing this absurd collection of ghosts only made the company's problems worse. They were now carrying too many brands, too many aging breweries, and a debt load that had ballooned to $700 million. To keep the lights on, they turned to contract brewing, utilizing their excess capacity to produce craft beers like Samuel Adams and Pete's Wicked Ale. It was a humiliating transition for the former kings of fire brewing. They were now merely the high-volume landlords for the next generation of innovators. The death spiral reached its terminal velocity in September 1998. For over a decade, Stroh had stayed afloat by brewing Pabst beer under contract, a deal worth millions in guaranteed revenue. But the merciless arithmetic of the industry struck one last time when they lost that contract to Miller. Overnight, Stroh was left with several million barrels of unused production capacity and no one to brew for. The rhythm of hammers had finally stopped. The silence that followed was the sound of a 149-year tradition hitting the floor. By early 1999, the shareholders' descendants of the man who had arrived in Detroit with $150 realized the fight was over. They had to choose between dying fighting or dying waiting. They chose to sell, splitting the remains of their once great empire between Pabst and Miller. The concrete palace was gone, the family fortune was decimated, and the Stroh name became a zombie brand, a label owned by strangers and stripped of the soul that had once defined a city. On February 8, 1999, history performed a cruel act of symmetry. Exactly 14 years to the day after Peter Stroh had stood before the microphones to announce the closure of the Detroit brewery, his cousin, John Stroh III, gathered the family shareholders for one final, agonizing summit. These weren't just corporate board members. They were the sixth and seventh generation descendants of Bernhard Stroh, the man who had arrived in Detroit with nothing but a wheelbarrow and a family recipe in 1850. For 149 years, the family had maintained 100% ownership of the company, a closed loop of grit and obsession that had survived every industrial storm until it hit the merciless arithmetic of the Schlitz debt. The room was heavy with a silence that carried the weight of centuries of tradition. There was no more room for improvisation or the stubborn refusal to quit that had saved them during Prohibition. The technology trap of their aging facilities and the poison pill of the $500 million debt had finally reached their terminal conclusion. By the time the ink dried on the final signature, the Stroh Brewery Company, once the third largest brewer in America, had been officially dismantled and sold for parts. In a deal that analysts viewed as an industrial autopsy, the brands were split between the only two players left with the scale to survive the beer wars. Pabst walked away with the core of the portfolio, inheriting names like Stroh's, Schlitz, and Old Milwaukee, effectively turning them into zombie brands to be brewed under contract by strangers. Miller took the high-value outliers, like Mickey's Malt Liquor and Henry Weinhard's. For the Stroh family, the collapse was a psychological and financial catastrophe. In less than 2 decades, a generational fortune valued at over $700 million had essentially evaporated into the unforgiving mathematics of corporate consolidation. They had gambled their entire legacy on the belief that an independent family firm could outmaneuver the giants of the arsenal of scale. They had tried to occupy the middle ground between a regional craft, hero, and a national titan, only to discover that in the modern American industry, the middle is a graveyard. The fortune that had been built through the fire of the Civil War and protected through the dry years of the Volstead Act was decimated by the simple fact that the rules of the game had changed, and the family hadn't changed fast enough. But as the family walked away from their 149-year empire, the true industrial aftermath was being felt on factory floors from Allentown to Longview. The human cost of the 1999 sale didn't appear in the clinical language of the press releases, which focused on strategic integration and asset rationalization. It was felt by workers who had spent 32 years on the bottling line, men who had started straight out of high school in 1967, believing that a union paycheck was a lifelong guarantee. For a 54-year-old brewery worker, the sale was not a transaction. It was a total erasure of his future. They were men with highly specialized skills in an industry that was rapidly hollowing itself out, leaving them with nowhere to go. As the gates locked at the remaining plants, the merciless arithmetic of decline rippled through communities that had used the brewery as their economic anchor. Families watched as their mortgages, car payments, and college funds, all built on the assumption of steady middle-class brewery wages, hit the unmistakable reality of the new job market. Many were forced into warehouse jobs at half their previous pay, while others saw their pensions reduced in the cold logic of bankruptcy proceedings. The Stroh name would survive on labels, and a zombie recipe would even return to Detroit in 2016, but the American Industrial Compact had been permanently broken. The rhythm of hammers was gone, replaced by a spreadsheet that decided 7 generations of work was worth less than a few points of market share for the giants. As we stand today at the corner of Gratiot Avenue and the I-75 freeway, the air is missing its signature, heavy weight. There is no longer the sweet, pervasive scent of roasting malt, no sharp, green bite of hops, and no radiating heat from the 10 to 15-foot flames that once defined the city's skyline. Where the industrial cathedral of the Stroh Brewery once loomed as the heartbeat of the East Side, there is now only Brewery Park, a generic landscape of corporate office buildings and asphalt parking lots. It is a place so thoroughly scrubbed of its history that, If you didn't know a 5-generation dynasty was forged in fire on this ground, you would never guess it. There is no plaque, no monument, and no formal acknowledgement that this was where thousands of workers spent their entire careers turning grain into the liquid pride of Detroit. The concrete palace has been replaced by a sterile architecture of absence, a monument to abandonment, that was eventually paved over to make room for a future that doesn't remember the past. In August 2016, however, a ghost tried to return to these streets. Pabst, the company that had eventually purchased the remains of the Stroh portfolio, partnered with a contract facility in Detroit's Corktown to launch a bohemian-style Pilsner based on the family's original 1850s recipe. It was the first Detroit-brewed Strohs in 31 years. On the day the first kegs were tapped, former employees, men who had once led tours through the original fire-brewing halls, showed up to taste the revival. Some of them cried as they held the glass, but as the liquid hit their tongues, the unmistakable reality was clear. It couldn't be the same. The fire-brewing copper kettles were long gone. The cathedral on Gratiot was rubble, and the family that had carried the name for 149 years no longer held the keys. The brand had survived, but it was what industry analysts call a zombie brand, a label attached to a product brewed by strangers, stripped of the soul and the community that once gave it meaning. The true tragedy of the Stroh legacy is the realization that, in the modern era of corporate scale, there was often no winning move. The merciless arithmetic of the industry had rewritten the rules of survival long before the family realized the game had changed. If they had stayed regional and small, the national giants armed with television advertising and massive distribution leverage would have eventually squeezed them into irrelevance. If they tried to grow big enough to compete, the poison pill of the $500 million debt required to buy Schlitz would act as a terminal anchor. They chose to fight for the future by going national, but they became the minnow that swallowed the whale, only to discover that the prize was a blueprint for disaster. The Stroh family lost a $700 million fortune, but the city of Detroit lost something far more valuable, a piece of the American industrial compact. Markets are exceptionally efficient at achieving economies of scale, but they are fundamentally blind to the human cost of that efficiency. They do not account for the 1,000 families whose middle-class security evaporated on February 8, 1985, or the generational belief that hard work and loyalty would be reciprocated by the company that fed you. The Stroh story is a haunting reminder that excellence is not a shield against the horizon. You can do everything right. You can survive Prohibition by making ice cream. You can maintain a unique, high-quality fire brewing process. And you can build a 150-year tradition of craftsmanship and still find your legacy reduced to a name on a can brewed by a contractor. In the end, the lion logo survives, but the industrial cathedral is gone. The lesson of the industrial aftermath is a bitter one. Growth can kill you. Debt can kill you. But staying small can kill you too. Sometimes, every choice leads to the same silence, and the only question left is whether you die fighting or die waiting. Stroh chose to fight, and in the generic offices of Brewery Park, we find the wreckage of that ambition. I'm your host, and this has been Industrial Aftermath. If you believe these stories of fire, precision, and the silence of the forge are worth remembering, leave a like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what your family's favorite local tradition was that the world moved past. We are keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching.